Okay, we'll get started and trying to make the most of this hour with you all. Really glad to see everybody join us today. We know a lot of people are on vacation or have a spring week this week, so really appreciate your attendance. This is our February webinar for Dementia Care Aware, Advanced Care Planning and Legal Needs for People Living with Dementia. I'm Anna Chodos, I'm your moderator, and I'm the Executive Director of Dementia Care Aware. And today I'm really excited to be joined by some incredible educators, speakers, and experts. Michelle Panlilio, who's the National Lead Dementia Care Specialist, for UCLA Alzheimer's and Dementia Care Program. Sarah Hooper, who's the Executive Director of the UCSF UC College of the Law San Francisco's Consortium on Law, Science, and Health Policy. And Kathryn Eubank, a professor of the division in the Division of Geriatrics, where I also work at UCSF. No one among our presenters had any financial disclosures to make today. And as we get started, I wanted to make sure people are aware of our program offerings in Dementia Care Aware. I know we're a new program, so we just want to make sure people have the opportunity to learn about us and how they can engage. We have everything on our website, so you're always welcome to go there, dementiacareaware.org, or email us with any concerns, questions, feedback, also appreciated. But the main offerings we have right now that we'd love for you to know about are our Warm Line, where people can right now via a forum on our website, but soon in mid-March via a live phone call with a consultant, get support and service for primary care providers and teams and just general needs around the care of people with dementia. We have ongoing trainings that will be coming out. Our webinars, of course, will be on our YouTube channel after they happen, but we also have online modules coming out in the next couple months, in addition to, of course, our core training on the cognitive health assessment. And we just released our first podcast. It's on most podcast platforms. It's called Dementia Care On Air, if you'd like to find it. And the first one is about the cognitive health assessment. So it explains it in 20 to 25 minutes and also has CME and CE credits with that. We have multiple opportunities for interactive live case conferences about dementia care through the University of California at Irvine series, ECHO series, and you can sign up through that via our website. And then if you are in a practice that needs support for dementia care, getting your primary care practice workflow together or figuring out how to incorporate screening or what to do next, we have multiple opportunities to support you to get hands-on coaching with experts, including, for example, from Michelle Panlilio, who is one of our discussants today. Just to point out that our online training is available, has 1.5 credits of CME and MOC credits, other continuing education credits, and kind of goes over the basics of the cognitive health assessment again. I realize we're a bit of a broken record, but we do want to make sure you make use of all the opportunities to do our training and take advantage of the continuing education opportunities. And then as we're going into this talk, specifically about advanced care planning and legal needs for people living with dementia and their support systems, I want to point out that one of the reasons we bring this up so early in our program, other than it's incredibly important, is because the cognitive health assessment itself as a screening approach encourages us right out of the gate to think about people's support systems. If they're there, and if they're there, kind of what is the extent and the formality of those support systems. So the screener, I just want to do a brief refresher, and you can learn more about it through our trainings and the podcast. But we start with just taking a brief history, usually with a single question, like, have you had any changes to your thinking or your memory in the last year? We encourage you to use tools, direct tools, to understand cognitive and functional decline and get a better sense of what's going on. And then finally, a brief question to ask about that person's support system. And so that really opens the door very early on for us to think about advanced care planning needs and to know who in that person's support system we might be working with on that issue. So that's why it's a great topic for us to get into early. And I know you're going to learn a lot in this session. Once again, here are presenters. You'll see their faces momentarily. And this is the order we hope to go in. And what you're going to learn today is defining the purpose and components of advanced care planning for patients living with dementia, especially sort of after we have that kickstart of the conversation with the cognitive health assessment. You'll be able to name 3 kinds of legal decision supporters that older patients commonly need in their lives as they go forward and live their lives. And then finally, how to initiate a conversation about advanced care planning and provide resources to patients. I'm about to hand it over to Michelle Panlilio to start our learning today. Just to let you guys know, at the end, we should have time for Q&A and really look forward to your questions. If you're having questions as we're going through, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring throughout. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Michelle. Great to have you today. Just let me know when you need me to advance your slides.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. My apologies. I'm calling from my cell phone, so I'm going to do my best. I think my computer actually just crashed. So you know what? We're here today. And so let's get started. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Panlilio, and I'm the National Lead Dementia Care Specialist for the UCLA Alzheimer's and Dementia Care Program, also known as the ADC. And I'm really honored to be here today with my colleagues from Dementia Care Aware, speaking about an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. So thank you so much for having me. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'd like to start off by introducing a patient and her daughter, Miriam. This is actually a patient of mine a few years ago. So Mrs. Chase is an 82-year-old woman. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia. She has a history of wandering and becoming distressed when she forgets where she is. She lives at home with Miriam, who is her primary caregiver and her IHSS caregiver. They live in an apartment and they don't have any other family to assist. So at the time when I met them, Mrs. Chase had 16 brief hospitalization and emergency room visits within the past 6 months, primarily for recurrent urinary tract infections and dehydration. So Miriam at the time verbalized that she had significant caregiver distress and stated that her mother had declined cognitively and physically during each one of the hospitalizations. So Miriam states that her wishes for her mother's health is to improve and really to get better. So again, when we first met, to me, it was clear that Mrs. Chase and her daughter needed some help with the planning for her care. And although it was our first meeting, that was the first day that we started having discussions on her advanced care planning. Next slide, please. So in my experience, when I've brought up the words advanced care planning, many of my patients and their families immediately assume that I'm asking about whether or not they want CPR. And sometimes they think I'm asking about a document that they completed about what their decisions were back when they were young and healthy. And on the contrary, advanced care planning is actually a discussion. And it's a discussion between the patient, their family or friends, and their healthcare team. It's a discussion that continues as they get older and as things change. So it's a discussion that accommodates their needs and wishes as the dementia progresses. So as a vital part of this, of the discussion, one of the key steps that we explore is just how much they understand about their illness, about their disease. And once they have a relatively good understanding that dementia is a progressive and it's a terminal disease, then we start talking about how they want to be treated, or I should say, if they want to be treated. Another vital component of this discussion is for them to determine and identify their preferred medical decision maker in preparation for the time when they're no longer able to make those decisions for themselves. Once this person has been identified, then together we determine advanced care planning that is in agreement with the patient's wishes. It's important to include family and friends who are significant in the patient's life, as long as you have the permission of the patient. Advanced care planning discussion could happen at any point in the disease, but ideally as early as possible and not when the patient is in the terminal stage. Overall, the goal is to achieve an outcome that is best for the patient's wishes, that is appropriate for the medical standards of care. Next slide, please. So in your practice, you're going to meet some patients, some caregivers who ask why advanced care planning is necessary for our patients who are living with dementia and their caregivers. There's actually several reasons why. So first and foremost, planning ahead provides a roadmap for planning for this patient's care. They may not be able to think ahead and anticipate what their future holds, but as clinicians, we know better, and we know that eventually they're not going to be as healthy as they are or as they were when they first walked into your clinic. For families and caregivers, many of them simply want to honor their loved one's wishes. Advanced care planning are highly personal, and perhaps more personal than anything in our lives as we become older adults. It shouldn't be decided during moments of crisis. And depending on the family, the social support, the personal goals and beliefs, sometimes religion, advanced care planning should take much thought and reflection by all of the parties involved. So for patients who have a large support group or multiple medical decision makers, it's important for that group of people to come to an agreement about the plan of care. And if there are individuals in the group who are not in agreement, this could cause some tension or friction in the patient's life. Sometimes in their effort to hold on to their loved one, family members will choose treatment options to prolong someone's life, even though this might go against the patient's wishes. For example, performing CPR or intubating a patient who stated their preferences of not wanting to be resuscitated. This type of a situation can lead to poor clinical outcomes for the patient, but it can also lead to caregiver distress, guilt, and depression. So again, going back to the concept that advanced care planning is a roadmap for their overall care, it provides a guide from when that patient is no longer able to make decisions for themselves. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, Dr. Hooper, Dr. Eubanks, and I will be talking about 3 key components in advanced care planning. I'll begin the presentation by speaking briefly on advanced directives and goals of care, while Dr. Hooper presents on the importance of financial and legal planning. During the latter part of the presentation, Dr. Eubanks will speak more on the practical and clinical side of discussing goals of care. Next slide, please. The Advanced Directive for Healthcare is an official legal document which allows a person to express his or her wishes for medical care during medical emergencies. So it's a document that gives direction to one's care preferences, beginning when they're even diagnosed with any healthcare issues. And it's something that really extends throughout the events that eventually lead to their decline and their death. Next slide, please. A healthcare power of attorney is the legal authority that allows another person to make medical decisions on behalf of another person, in the case that person is not able to make decisions for themselves. Depending on how the directive is completed, there may be a primary, a secondary, or tertiary healthcare decision maker for that person. Advanced healthcare directives typically include the patient's general wishes for end-of-life care. The document will state the patient's wishes on whether or not they want their life to be prolonged if they have a terminal condition or if they have an incurable disease. Additionally, advanced directives can also state the patient's wishes about artificial nutrition or feeding tubes. For healthcare providers who are taking care of patients who are living with dementia, prioritizing the completion of advanced directives early in the patient's disease is key, because we all know that dementia is a progressive disease. And as much as possible, we want to capture the patient's wishes while the disease is still in the early stages. And again, they're still able to make these decisions for themselves. Next slide, please. Aside from assigning one's medical decision maker, another component of advanced care planning is to have the goals of care discussion. As I mentioned earlier, advanced care planning and one's goals of care are very personal and can vary quite a bit from one person to another person. So there really is no right or wrong choice. The objective of having this discussion is to identify goals for that patient towards the end of their life. So on this slide, I listed some of the more common goals identified by my patients and their families over the years that I've been in this role. Anecdotally, most of my patients have stated wishes to stay home and be surrounded by family. Some patients have very specific goals, such as living long enough so that they can see their children get married or that they can meet their grandchildren. With that said, we have also had patients who wish to remain alive, no matter what, or for as long as possible, and I've had patients tell me that, they believe that a person can have a good quality of life as long as they are surrounded by family, even if this means that they are breathing, eating, or surviving through artificial measures. And again, these preferences are not necessarily right or wrong, just personal goals of care. Next slide, please. So in looking at this graph, I wanted to briefly address the difference between formal and an informal discussion on advanced care planning. Formal advanced care planning typically includes completed legal documents stating one's preferences on their decision makers and their end-of-life care. Informal advanced care planning, on the other hand, are discussions that are informally documented in one's medical records. Typically, this might look more of a narrative in the medical records, not necessarily a document. The study shows that, in racial and ethnic groups, they are more likely to complete advanced care planning if this is done informally. So the key point that we wanted to pass along is that, while both informal and formal planning are helpful with goals of care and treatment preferences, formal planning is most important for designation of a healthcare agent. And if you are only able to complete this planning partially in your practice, you should prioritize for all of your patients to document a healthcare agent in an advanced directive or a durable power of attorney for healthcare. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to our patient, Mrs. Chase, and her daughter, Miriam. To our audience, I would like you to ask yourselves, do you believe that Mrs. Chase and her daughter need to complete advanced care planning? And does her team need to address the goals of care with Mrs. Chase and her daughter? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Mrs. Chase has a progressive and terminal disease. So, but fortunately, she has named her daughter Miriam as her primary decision maker. As her medical team, we need to work together with the patient and her daughter to make sure that they have a good understanding of the disease and its trajectory, so that we are able to provide the appropriate medical and social recommendations and resources for the patient and her daughter. So at this time, I'm going to turn over this presentation over to my colleague, Dr. Hooper, who will discuss the financial and legal aspects of advanced care planning.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful. And I appreciate the elevation to doctor status. I am, however, a lowly lawyer. I'm on the faculty at UC Law SF in San Francisco, formerly called UC Hastings. And I co-direct a program, a medical legal partnership that has worked closely with clinicians at UCSF and the VA to provide free legal assistance to low-income patients for about over a decade now. So I come as a lawyer who has a lot of experience working with clinicians and patients on these issues, and particularly as someone who's thought a lot about legal interventions for people with dementia. So I'm going to pick up where Michelle left off and pick up this case of Mrs. Chase. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let's say no planning or actions are taken on Mrs. Chase's long-term care needs, even though we think and have identified that care planning is something that she and Miriam need. A month later, Mrs. Chase is taken to the hospital by police after they found her at a bus stop a block from her home. She was in her bathrobe with no shoes, crying and asking for help, but she was unable to say where she lived. And she was dehydrated and delirious. Miriam was on her way to the hospital and she was extremely upset. She said she left for just 20 minutes to get milk from a neighbor, and when she came back, her mother was gone. She says, what do? I can't just lock her up in her own house. So the hospital discharge team thinks that Mrs. Chase needs more care than she's receiving in her home and that she needs to be placed in a facility. They have contacted a local assisted living facility that advertises they provide memory care. And the facility has available beds, but is refusing to admit her until they have a financially responsible party who is able to sign her in. And what the team has discovered is that Mrs. Chase never named Miriam or anyone else as a financial agent. So this is something we see all the time in hospitals, or I should say more than we would like to see. Someone with dementia needs more long-term care supports and services, but hasn't appointed legally recognized decision makers. Those decision makers aren't prepared for these decisions or to manage money around them. And without someone to help manage money or benefits, like Medi-Cal benefits, this can really slow transitions of care down, sometimes leading to extended length of stay. And the reason for this is that healthcare agents who, as Michelle just mentioned, are people that you name in an advance directive to make medical decisions for you, do not have authority to manage money or benefits for the patient. They need separate legal authority to do that. Miriam specifically would need separate legal authority to do that. And it's important to understand that long-term care is not just a medical decision. It is very much a financial decision. People with dementia can live a very long time with limited capacity and require years of long-term care. And this chart here from our friends at Kaiser Family Foundation helps to illustrate the costs of those care. And most of that care is not covered by Medicare, which is something many patients and caregivers don't understand. Rather, patients and caregivers will have to pay out of pocket for long-term care until they spend down to Medi-Cal eligibility. Even if someone is already Medi-Cal eligible, it takes a lot of paperwork financial paperwork to obtain and maintain eligibility in that program. And a caregiver has to have the ability to manage, to access, first of all, to manage and submit that information about a patient's finances in order to work with the Medi-Cal program and manage their benefits. So this is something, financial caregiving is really critical in dementia, not just for people with a lot of money, but people with very little money as well. Next slide, please. So who can make long-term care decisions? Well, first, we always start by asking if the patient can make long-term care decisions. So in this case, we would ask first whether Mrs. Chase herself has the capacity to make decisions about long-term care. And for most of us, and for Mrs. Chase in this situation, it's unlikely she's unable to make this decision entirely by herself. These are complicated decisions. It's likely that she needs at least some support to make decisions. But if ideally she would be able to say who she trusts to help her make the decision and articulate why that person is appropriate. If she can do that, it's possible she still has the capacity to formally appoint that person as her agent. And we would want to try that route first and have Mrs. Chase choose her legal decision maker. If she is no longer able to do so, or if we are worried about the risk of elder abuse or exploitation, we would then turn to other options. Next slide, please. There are 5 kinds of legally recognized financial caregivers that Mrs. Chase might have. And ideally, she would have the capacity to appoint an agent in a durable power of attorney for finances, which is in that first box on the left there. This is a document that states a choice of financial decision maker as well as the powers that they have. And these powers can be minimal or they can be large. Ideally, they are tailored to the needs of the individual person. And like advanced care planning for medical decisions are the products of good, thoughtful conversations between a patient and their possible agents. The decisions in a power of attorney can range from the ability to just access and manage bills or the ability to sell the house or make gifts to other people. Those are really large powers. And so it's important to think carefully about who this person should be. Excuse me. It can also give the authority to someone to deal with housing issues or hire an attorney or another professional. Only a patient with capacity can complete this document. Once they lose capacity, they cannot. So every person with a dementia diagnosis or who is at risk for incapacity, no matter how little money they have, should have one of these documents as early as possible. An additional kind of decision maker in the gray box there is a representative payee. A representative payee is someone who could be appointed to manage Mrs. Chase's benefits that come from the Social Security Administration. So these can include retirement benefits, disability benefits, or Medi-Cal benefits. Mrs. Chase could nominate a representative payee ahead of time, or if she no longer has capacity, Miriam could go to the Social Security Administration to seek status as a rep payee. And the Social Security Administration would have to approve the representative payee. In the yellow box is something called a VA fiduciary, which is very similar to a representative payee, except their kind of purview is VA benefits. So if you have patients who are veterans, a VA fiduciary is someone that you want to have on your radar for them. A VA fiduciary cannot be appointed ahead of time, unfortunately. This is something that a caregiver would need to request of the VA administration once someone has lost capacity. So those top 3 are kind of the most important, most common people for lifetime decision making. If you have someone, a patient with assets, they might have a need for a trustee in a living trust. And a trustee is similar to an agent in a durable power of attorney for finances. It's a different kind of legal document. There's more work that needs to be done to establish a trust, and it can be more expensive. So not everyone needs a trust, but some people do, and they can be really important tools in managing patients' assets during their lifetime, including for things like long-term care. And so these 4 roles are roles that Mrs. Chase could appoint Miriam to, or someone else in her family, or a private professional could serve in one of these roles. If none of these people have been named, if the patient now totally lacks capacity, or unfortunately, as sometimes happens, if one of them has exploited the patient, we might then need to turn to conservatorship. Next slide, please. There are now many kinds of conservatorship in California. The pathway that is most common for people with dementia is called probate conservatorship. And this is a court process to establish a surrogate decision maker called a conservator. Probate conservatorship can be initiated by any interested person. So it could be by Miriam, it could be by a public agency, it could be by a friend. The person who initiates conservatorship is most often also petitioning to be the conservator. But of course, the public guardian's office is another entity that can serve in this role. Next slide, please. Importantly, the legal standard for conservatorship is very high, and the reason for that is that it is a intensive legal intervention. You are removing someone's civil rights from them, and so we want to be very sure that this is the only remaining option left to us, the best possible option left to us. And so someone petitioning for conservatorship has to show by clear and convincing evidence that someone like Mrs. Chase is truly unable to provide for her personal needs, and or is substantially unable to manage financial resources or resist fraud or undue influence. And we have to show that this was the least restriction option available or tried. Next slide, please. And something in working with healthcare teams that I found a lot is that we need to ask the question, will conservatorship actually solve the problem? And so it's important to understand a few things about a conservator or the public guardian's office. They are a substitute decision maker, but they are working with the same resources and assets that a patient came in with, or even less sometimes, because conservatorship is generally paid for out of the estate of the patient. And so if you're looking for conservatorship as a way to get new resources for somebody, this is not necessarily the thing that is going to do that. A conservator or public guardian cannot force facilities to take patients. They cannot create beds or housing in a community where they don't exist, and they do not serve as 24/7 caregivers. They are just making different decisions than the patient would have made if we think that the patient is not able to make those decisions safely. All right, so conservatorship is something that we want to resort to as a very last possible measure. And we really can prevent the need for a lot of conservatorship through really careful advanced planning that considers both medical decisions and financial and legal decisions that someone with dementia will need to make. Next slide. Something that's important to point out about planning is that the people who need it most are often the least likely to get it. So our patients with complex medical and social needs are the least likely to get legal help. 70% of low-income older adults reported at least one civil legal problem in 2021, and 91% of them did not receive any or enough legal help for those problems. And these are not trivial things that they need help with. These are consumer issues, these are health issues, these are income issues. And the reason that they're not accessing legal help is related to lack of knowledge about the legal issues that they have and where to go for help. Next slide, please. So what you can do as clinicians is really help us close the knowledge gap. You can help point out to your patients and caregivers that financial and legal planning is an important part of dementia care and is something that they should be working on alongside medical planning. And CMS has actually recognized that this is part of quality dementia care. You can see excerpted language from a MIPS high priority quality metric in dementia that calls out that following a diagnosis of dementia, health and social care professionals should provide information about financial and legal advice and advocacy and medical legal issues. So I believe I'm ending there, but I'll thank you so much and we'll pass off the next phase to our colleague, Dr. Kathryn Eubank.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really valuable information. I have to say that I did not learn in medical school. So thank you. If you want to advance, Anna. So this section is just going to be more on the practical parts of how to initiate conversations with advanced care planning. For some clinicians, depending on your experiences that you've had around this topic, it may feel more comfortable for some of you, and this will be very old hat. And for others, you may not have done as much of this. And so we're going to kind of come at it at the perspective as people that may not have had as much experience doing this. One thing to keep in mind is that patients really do want to participate in advanced care planning. We're often nervous to bring these topics up because we think that caregivers or patients don't want to talk about it. But repetitively in surveys that are done, we know that patients with dementia and their caregivers both want to have these conversations. They prefer that these conversations would have started sooner than they ended up starting, although many of them said not necessarily on the day of the initial diagnosis. They also found that completing assessments of their values was a positive experience overall as they got to review what was most important to them in their lives. We know from other studies as well that patients would prefer to have these conversations with their primary care providers or their primary care teams, although oftentimes they end up having them in emergent situations with people that don't know them quite as well. Other things to keep in mind is that it really is important to have a knowledge of the disease process for good decision making. And so part of advanced care planning is also making sure that patients understand their diagnosis of dementia, whether this is something that might be a more rapidly evolving disease and therefore these discussions may need to take place faster versus something like Alzheimer's that we know takes years and years before they get to the position where they're going to lack capacity often. Advanced care planning is also best seen as a series of conversations. And so this graphic across the bottom is not saying that this is the order that these conversations need to take place in, but more to say that this is really a series of conversations that you're going to have over time, depending on the diagnosis and honestly how much time you have. So all ACP does not need to take place in one visit or by even one member of the healthcare team. And as Michelle said earlier, both formal and informal advanced care planning is very beneficial if it's documented in the chart. And so even if formal paperwork is not completed, documenting what those patients' values are in the chart are still something that can be gone back to later to either help in conversations with the primary caregivers or in determining what the patient will receive at the end of life. It may be important to discuss the patient's preferences, both with the patient as well as with the caregiver there separately, depending on that caregiver and what that relationship is and what your feeling is about how much the caregiver may or may not speak for the patient or over the patient. And so it's not unusual to have these conversations with the patient separately and then to confirm things with the caregiver, either on that date or a later date. It's also very important that we review the advanced care plan through the illness trajectory just to assure that it continues to reflect the patient's wishes because things do change over time. And so this schematic again here might start with something like the CHA where they name a healthcare agent even before the dementia diagnosis is made. And then education about their diagnosis, discussion of their values, and it may end with something like a pulse saying what they would want at the very end of life. Next slide. In initiating the conversation, it's a step that we often may forget, but it's important to ask permission to have these conversations. So in these next several slides, we've provided some sample language. This is not language that you have to use, but if you're less familiar with having these conversations, this can give you some language to start these conversations. So one example may be, it's important to us as your care team to know what values you hold most dear. Can we talk about that today? Or we want to care for you the way that best fits with your values. To do that, it is helpful to think ahead to how life may look for you several years from now. Can we plan time for that during your next visit? Next slide. After asking for permission, and if the patient or caregiver agrees, then we again start with open-ended questions as we've been taught for most of the conversations that we have for patients. This may be something as simple as asking, what do you understand about your diagnosis? This question is often important at the beginning of these conversations because maybe what's needed on this particular conversation is a lot more education about their diagnosis and what lies ahead so that they can make an informed decision. Other things, at this time in life, what values do you hold most dear? Or what things are you finding meaningful and important at this time in your life? It might be family, friends, hobbies, etc., but it's important to know what they're finding meaning for right now. Next slide. Continuing with open-ended questions. It's often helpful for patients to think about other family members who may have had a similar disease or even just gone through a serious illness. So have you ever experienced a family member or a close friend with a serious illness? What was that like? What went well during that time, or maybe what didn't go well during that time, to help the patient reflect or the caregiver reflect on how they may want things. Next slide. As the conversation progresses, we do need to get more specific to really complete that formal part of the advanced care planning. Might be as simple as just asking, have you ever completed an advanced directive? Notice that we don't often start immediately with that. The things that patients often find valuable in these ACP discussions are somebody knowing what their values are. So making sure that we take the time to do that early in the discussion can make these later questions where we really get down to the nitty-gritty a little bit easier for them to appoint people then. Talking about a healthcare agent, if you were in a situation where you could not speak for yourself, is there someone you would trust to make decisions about your care? We often will follow that up with, why did you choose that person? And this might help us with understanding how much they understand what this decision means, and do they have the capacity to make these decisions? Are there any circumstances where you would not trust that person to make decisions for you? Next slide. Talking about a financial decision maker. As dementia worsens, it is helpful to have someone you can trust help you with tasks such as paying your bills or managing your money. Is there someone you would trust with that? Why did you choose that person? Are there situations where you would worry about that person making decisions for you? And then following that up with, have you ever written this down in a legal form? Again, completing the loop from informal to formal advanced care planning. Next slide. There are two resources I want to spend a little time talking about. Somebody actually already placed one of these in the chat if you may have already seen this. The first one is prepareforyourcare.org. Both the resources I'm going to talk about are free and very high quality websites that can help your patient both individually or you can use them in clinic. The prepareforyourcare.org website has both videos for independent patient use that walks them through the steps of how to complete an advanced directive, helps them decide what is valuable to them and what may be less valuable to them, has videos showing them how to have these discussions with their family members or their caregivers. There are also videos on the website for use in advanced care planning in the clinic. There are training resources for clinic staff. There our advanced directive forms. An example is here, the California Advanced Healthcare Directive, where it walks the patient or their caregiver through each step of the advanced directive, with an advanced directive at the end that can just be printed out and signed. And so they can complete it literally online while they're there. There's, so all those forms are there. On to the next slide. Another very helpful resource is the lawhelpcaliforniaca.org. This is a legal website that has a lot of forms on it, and both the DPOA for finances as well as other advanced directive forms are there. There's also legal information about many senior issues. On the lower picture here, I want to show you that you can click on a topic here at seniors, and then they will have a long list. This actually scrolls down further when you're on the website of topics specific to seniors that gives both them, they can go to this website on their own, or you or your office staff information about how to complete these things. So here you'll see information about assisted living, elder abuse, applying for Medicare or Medi-Cal services, Social Security, estate planning, those type of topics. This can also connect patients to specific resources in their area. So there is a page there that you can type in which county you or your patient are in, what services you're looking for, and it will bring up a set of resources for you here. So this is the top picture here on this slide. It's a legal directory. You can see that I typed in Fresno County, senior topics, and power of attorney or conservatorship. And there are legal aid resources that come up, as well as certified lawyer referral services and things. So this is both helpful, I think, for the clinic and the staff to use, as well as sending patients or their caregivers directly towards it. Something that we often hear is that families don't have either they don't know where to go when they're trying to set up these resources, or they don't have the money to do it. And this does offer resources to help them through that. Next slide. So in wrapping up, the key points that we wanted to make here is that the purpose of advanced care planning is to understand and document a patient's values, their preferences, and their goals pertaining to their future care, and to document surrogate decision makers. There are three kinds of decision support that we feel like all older patients commonly need: a healthcare agent to make medical decisions, a financial DPOA to make sure that they don't get trapped without the ability to utilize finances that they have. If within the VA, they may also need a VA fiduciary, or things like for Social Security or even private retirement funds if they have them, maybe a rep payee. We feel like these three decision support makers are needed regardless of what the person's financial state is. We often hear from patients, well, I don't really have a lot of money, so I don't really need those people. But there are often resources there, and they're just hard to get a hold of when a patient needs them if these things are not set up. 2 free planning resources that we also feel like are very high quality that are available to patients, caregivers, and clinicians is the Prepare for Your Care website, prepareforyourcare.org, and lawhelpcalifornia.org. There will be additional medical legal training that's available throughout the Dementia Care Aware. You will see links for some of these on the websites, and we definitely invite you to also contact us to schedule trainings for your team or for yourself on these topics if you like. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Chodos to do question and answer. I'm sure there'll be a lot of great questions, especially Sarah here. We have some legal expertise on the line. Anna?
Great point. I'll invite my colleagues here to turn your cameras back on. We have had great comments and questions. So, fantastic presentations. We packed a lot in, although it was like very easy to follow. So I just want to thank you all so much. And just based on the engagement from the audience, I think we have a really informed, a really thoughtful, and really engaged audience. So I want to thank you guys as well. We have a few minutes here for this Q&A. What I will do is just leave up this summary slide so you can see the resources again, and point out, because people put in the Q&A, which hopefully people have access to I think it looks like some people aren't able to see everything, but there were some really great points made. And one of them, I think just informationally I'd love to share with everybody is that advanced care planning isn't there to replace actually caring for people. So a lot of points were made about making sure that people are also connected to resources and support. First of all, that's, just part of good care, but it can help reduce stress and anxiety around kind of the process of living with dementia, getting the diagnosis, and might actually put people in a better place to do advanced care planning with us on the healthcare and legal teams. Also, that somebody pointed out that they really loved your process map, Kathryn, and that they would also put dementia support in there as well as something that can kind of, obviously it's just a crucial part of care. I think we are trying to make a very strong point here generally that supporting someone living with dementia support system, as well as supporting the person with dementia, are crucial, and that care is a process that begins with the very first symptoms. And we totally agree that people should be connected to dementia support as much as possible. And I think the point that they made that was really important is how much hope and that can give people, and how that obviously can also help people think about the future that we're trying to discuss with them in the process that we described today of advanced care planning. The other thing is there was a great resource other than Prepare for Your Care, which I think we all love here. Also the Conversation Project. So there's a link to that in the Q&A, and just want to make people aware. And then there was a brief question about logistics, which I should have addressed earlier. This has been recorded. We'll make the recording available on YouTube, and we'll post the PDFs of the slides so that you guys can have those after this is over. Some of the questions that are still outstanding, which I think are really interesting, and some of them already got some answers in the Q&A. For example, can your spouse, what if the person has a spouse? Can they do the financial management? The answer is basically no. You want to have a formal process. They're still legally separate people in that regard. Obviously, if there are joint accounts, maybe that, takes care of some of the financial management, but in general, the advice that Sarah Hooper gave was to be clear about who has permission and authority to touch what accounts on behalf of somebody who may need that management. I wanted to ask one question, which I think is, you addressed, Sarah, but I did want to make sure you had another opportunity, which is just if people don't appear to have the capacity to appoint a decision maker, the point I understood from you is that then you would proceed to other legal avenues, for example, the courts, to work on appointing somebody. And this dovetails with the issue of if people don't have the capacity and or don't have somebody. So if you could just summarize that one more time, it looked like that was of interest to the audience.
Yeah. So if someone lacks capacity, has no one to make decisions for them, has done no planning, then we may need to turn to conservatorship. But it is helpful to do some groundwork and to first, if you can, investigate their Medi-Cal eligibility, if you can do a investigation into what appropriate supports and resources there are in the community first. And if you can get those supports in place, you may not need conservatorship, but it's important to flag people early on who don't have someone or that you believe don't have someone. There are still tools available to support that person. There are still resources. And if we are worried that they're going to end up in the hospital with no one to speak for them, that's all the more reason to flag that early and often in their chart and start to address it.
Thank you. There was another thorny issue, and I think we've all seen this, where that was brought up in the Q&A about when people are just over the Medi-Cal limit, and so they're not going to be eligible for Medi-Cal benefits, but really don't have the funds to pay for more support. Just want to see if people have any thoughts on that one. Who would help them pay for, long-term supports and services, for example?
as with most things, the devil is in the details. It depends on how much they're over, what their monthly expenses are, a whole host of things. So turn to your social work teams and or your legal aid partners in the community who are fluent in the language of Medi-Cal eligibility. And this is why dementia care is a team sport. We need to work together to put all of these pieces together.
Thank you. I'm going to answer the last question that just came in really quick. And then Kathryn, I'm going to bring a question, and Michelle, I'll bring a question to you guys. So somebody asked, can a patient with moderate dementia have the capacity to appoint a DPOA? What's the cutoff on memory tests? And again, I would say capacity is decision specific. You can kind of march through the criteria for that decision. And in fact, it may be different, even criteria than we think of for medical decision making. There's not a cutoff with a dementia stage, although it's clear that people who are in the severe stages or later moderate stages may be less able to get through the conversation or have capacity. It's certainly going to be correlated, but it will always be an individual and decision specific moment. And so you would kind of walk through the capacity criteria. This is a topic we're definitely going to come back to in additional content in the courses that we have. And as you saw, one of the legal courses Sarah and her team are working on is capacity, because this is such a thorny, complicated, and also important issue. So I just want to thank you for that really great question.
Can I add something to that real quick,
yes.
Anna? I will say that over the course of my career doing this 25 years now is my bar for a patient having capacity has lowered and lowered and lowered. Like patients know if they can truly have just a basic understanding about who cares for me, who do I trust, then it's oftentimes we add a lot of additional things onto that. But some of these care decisions can be very simple. Patients know who they trust, who's cared for them for years, even after they've lost ability to do something very complicated, like I'm going to explain a very complicated surgical procedure to you. That's very different than I can still appoint a healthcare agent. So one of the points that Dr. Chodos made is that this is very dependent on the question being asked. And so unfortunately, as a clinician, sometimes it is more time consumptive. It's not as easy as a number on a MOCA or a mini mental status exam or anything like that, but just to really have a very basic conversation and to give the patient the benefit of the doubt, honestly, for most of these decisions, including financial decision makers. We have the medical legal team. Sarah often comes into our hospital making decisions with our patients around financial appointments, and really just a few questions that they have to answer and get right to be able to do that.
Awesome advice from a truly expert clinician. Michelle, I'm going to ask this question of you and we'll wrap it up. And I want to make a plug for everybody that you can actually reach us in the warm line if you have a thorny clinical scenario, including around capacity issues. We come across this all the time. So would love to support you in the care of your patients. So feel free to check out our warm line, and the CE information is in our webinar chat again, and you can always email us for links to how to get CE. So Michelle, you started us off, you really soldiered through. I'm so sorry about your technical difficulties, but you were amazing. And so this question I feel like is good for you, and then we'll wrap it up after you answer. The question is, okay, so a person says, you know, the patient says, I really want to, family is the most important thing, and I'd like to prolong life as long as possible to be with them, presumably. And I want to be full code, you know, including intubation, all the support. How do you approach that? I think the implication here is that at certain stage that may not be a clinically appropriate recommendation on our end, but just if you can leave us with those thoughts, because that's a weighty issue and an important one, and we see it all the time. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, this happens often enough. And, you know, when it does happen, it's something that really sticks with you as a clinician, whether, you know, something that you take home. I think for this particular family, you know, it was important for us to figure out what is their goal. And if their goal is not aligned with what their plan is, then we kind of bring it back to, well, is it really your goal to spend more time with mom, or is it to have her in a nursing home? Because if this is what you choose to do, if she's going to have a trach and if she's going to have a feeding tube, that's not really a good way, and that's not going to keep her at home with you. And I feel like, as long as we are, we're supportive with a family, that we stay and we keep on talking about our decisions and how that's going to impact their decision making, then at the end of the day, we are honoring the family's wishes. The time that this has happened as does in the past and the patient would pass away, typically the family would call us back after the patient passed and would tell us, despite everything that's happened, I felt really, I felt that my medical team, my mom's medical team supported us in our decision making, and really they're so appreciative.
Well, thank you so much. We do need to conclude. This was an amazing hour. I really appreciate all your expertise and incredible presentations and the wonderful questions and engagement from the attendees. We are all here for you. Please reach out, any questions, additional thoughts, and appreciate your contributions to Dementia Care Aware as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.